I'm going to talk to you about world building, which is a part of my larger interest in futures and robust decision making. And so I got just a couple of slides to frame up some of the themes here. I'm going to talk a little bit about that workshop that you have the document from, but hopefully we'll have lots of times for questions. So anyway, it turns out to be really hard actually to envision futures that are not really just reflections of our concerns in the present. And there's a lot of ways to tell that story and a lot of empirical data on that. But one way to tell the story that I really is to this particular book, which is on the occasion of the three World Exposition in Chicago, which was a fairly big deal at the time. A lot of books about it, actually. And it was like the 400th anniversary of the Europeans arriving in the Americas. Some enterprising group commissioned 74 experts at the time to predict what the US would look like 100 years later. And this guy, David Walter, I think, anyway, found these essays and republished them in 1992. And so you can flip through these 100-year projections at the time they were projecting. And they're really amazing. Most are totally wrong. Some are really weirdly close to the truth, but in weird ways. There was I think a former postmaster general of the United States described a world where all the big American cities were attached by pneumatic tubes. So you could go stuff your letter in a tube in New York and it would pop out in Chicago a few minutes later. An internet economy, but with physical things going around. There was a musician who said that, in the 1990s, by the end of the 20th century, America would be the center of world music, which, in some ways is true, but this guy was a classical pianist. And so it's pretty clear that what we've got now is not what he was imagining. It's really clear as you read these essays is that they're really describing the present, but reflected out into the future. So that's very cool for essays, but it's a big problem as you think about, policy, because it's clear, particularly in our times right now, that the future is going to be really different than the present. And this is, I'm mostly a climate change person. And this is just, the story of the Great Acceleration, which I'll go through super quick. But, over the last 50 years or so, we've had this exponential growth in people capita and populations, huge flood in the cities. Over the last 40 or 50 years, this huge rise in income inequality. This is Piketty's data for the US. At the same time, we're pushing against planetary boundaries in a really serious way, as the climate change talk we just had refers to. And these are all biophysical and measurable things, but the sort of the basic organization of society is shifting. We had 37 years of social democracy, which largely fell apart in the 70s. And then we've had this sort of neoliberal phase for about 40 years, and that seemed to have come apart in the financial shocks in 2008. And we're floating around and looking for new paradigms. So it's pretty clear that, and then all the technology change. So it's pretty clear the world is headed to a very different place. And so how do we get our heads around that? How do we plan? And so world building is meant to be a way to address that. The basic idea in world building is to, move away from telling a story about the future and creating a coherent context or a really detailed, rich description of a future world that then stories and experiences can emerge from. And this I'm pulling a lot of this from my colleague Ann Pendleton Julian's book with John Seely Brown called Design Unbound, where they go through this in great detail. But they start with Lewis Carroll and Alice in Wonderland as early examples of world building. But this really got going. The big marker is as Steven Spielberg's Minority Report, where they actually spent a huge amount of time in this movie creating a world in which Tom Cruise could then have his story told about him. But the basic idea here is we're going to start with what if propositions and then build them out across many relevant domains. The core concepts include shifts from a story to a context to really building out detail across multiple domains, focusing on coherence more than completeness. So at least, getting the pieces that you do have to be coherent. They may be, an imagined world, but the assumptions need to fit together, and then immersive, and so that you can, imagine, really imagine others living in it. And so this is, this Mandela graphic, Mandela that Alex McDowell with the Minority Report were associated with. And it's a little bit hard to read, but it just shows all these different domains: social, mental, science, physical. And as you go through a world build, you take some number of these and describe what's going on in these particular domains that describe this world. The reports you guys were just doing is, we're focused on the technology, which would certainly be one. But in a world build, you'd also think about, what is going on in the social world? How do people relate to each other? What do they think about? How do they find meaning, interest in their lives? What does government look like, and so forth? You work through these various domains. One of the things that I've been interested in, and the workshop that we're about to discuss was intended to set up, is this backcasting idea, where you start with a future world and then think about paths that would bring you there. And this is, again, to break the tyranny of the present, that if you think about, I would like to go in this direction and start in the present, you get very tied up in the present, and it gets difficult to break out of those bounds. But if you start with one of these imagined worlds and then step back to the present and work to there, you can often learn a lot more about ways to get there, enablers and barriers, and what are appropriate near-term actions. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this. This workshop we did about 4 years ago, 5, I think. Yeah, and we're basically looking at the AI and jobs issue, but we wanted to get beyond just jobs and look at work as a thing both that gives people income, but also meaning and context and structure for their lives. And so we did a 1.5-day workshop. It was about 15 people. We divided them into 3 teams. It was a studio arrangement where we had, sheets and boards laid out in 3 corners of a large room, and the teams would work in their corners. You could go visit the others, see what they were doing, and then, at various points during the session, everybody would stop what they were doing and go around, and each group would present. But Anne is as an architect by training, and so you envision creating these worlds in an architectural studio context. So we try to get a very broad range of people: technologists, social scientists, architects, lawyers, policy experts, topical experts. So this is a pretty complicated slide, but essentially the way we laid out this 1.5-day session was we, began with some introductions of the problem we were interested in and the world building approach. But we gave them then this large scale what if question. What if in 2050, technology working with humans, technology plus humans, create a world in which work? And then we left it open. We gave them this scenario, basic scenario framework to riff off of. And this is, to what extent is the technology enable new kinds of work versus with humans versus, machines do all the work. That's the horizontal axis. And then on the vertical axis is the technology optimized for the owners of the machine, or is the technology optimized for everyone to use? So this is a standard scenario planning 2x2 matrix, gives you 4 scenarios, a future of astonishment up in the upper right, a future of dismay down below it, abundance in the upper left, and And in the lower left, people will rise up before the machines do. Having seeded this, we sent the groups off into their corners and asked them to come up with a speculative scenario. Sorry, I repeated that twice. To focus it down. And so the teams went off, and each of the teams riffed on this in a different way. One of the teams came up with, basically worked right in this format. And what if in 2050 technology enables a post-scarcity world where everybody's material needs are met? And then how can technology and humans partner so that humans enjoy a meaningful life? And so then this group riffed on that. One of the other groups had an origin story, which essentially told the story of increasing climate chaos. And the other group had a similar sort of origin story, which went into data as a central organizing value in society. I spent most of my time with the second group, nor the group mentioned here, so I'll talk about that. But then generated assumptions or logic points, but essentially key assumptions that are meant to capture what's going on in this world and how it fits together. So this group posited post-scarcity material world, which is inherent in the what if question. But then there were all these things that are important to people that were still scarce: prestige, power, time in a human's day, human's attention span, and the notion of craft, objects or ideas that have a human touch to them. And those things are still scarce. We assumed that there were many different ways to measure the value of work beyond just money, income. And then we had this idea that everyone had a personal lifelong AI guru, an AI that was developed that they controlled, that they had, that served them, which helped individuals pursue a meaningful life. And each of the groups was given this set of domains over here on the left: technology, physical, mental, social, and questions underneath. How do we live? How will we live? And we then, each group worked through and filled out as many of these as they could, and just described in detail what each of these looked like. One of the devices that we used in this workshop, in part because we had a small number of people in each group, is we asked people to take on two personas and describe what life was like in this world from the perspective of each of those. And what you saw was pretty much everybody developed a persona that was, a future version of them. But then many people had a second persona, which was very different, sort of opposite of them. So that really enriched the imagination and the envisioning, because people, envision themselves in this future world, but they also envision someone very different from themselves in a future world. And that interplay helped open up the conversation. So that's all I have on slides, but I'd be happy to answer questions and describe this process a little bit more to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions right away?
I have a question for Robert. Yeah. Robert, when you did these workshops, what kind of format did the deliverable take, the thing that the groups created? Did they end up creating rich scenarios and stories, or was it bullet point, what we saw and what you presented?
No, we had people thinking with pens, essentially. So everybody had magic markers. It was a room with whiteboards everywhere, and then we had flip charts. And so basically people drew a lot, so it was a lot of drawing, and most of the people were artistically inclined. So it was not like started drawing pictures, but this is RAND, right? So it's a lot of stuff. People would write words, put circles around things, boxes and arrows, and a lot of diagrams, and some sort of stick figure sketches. The deliverables were first the sheets and then a lot of photographs of the whiteboards. And these are low-tech whiteboards that automatically upload themselves to the cloud. And then each group gave a presentation to the other groups at the end, and which was a mix of PowerPoint notes and comments. And so we collected all those, and we've got those stored away someplace. And then the formal reporting of it was the document that you saw.
Thank you.
I also have a question regarding the deliverables, if I could ask.
Yeah.
So just in terms of how the scenarios are presented or how the worlds are presented, are you seeing mostly more, descriptive, and this is how people will live, this is, how things will work, and this is the dynamics, and this is how, you should prestige, or have you seen perhaps also more storytelling ways of describing worlds, like having a protagonist? So if you've seen both, what are the pros and cons?
It was more the former, that it was, descriptions rather than. My video disappeared. I meant to reboot my camera. I'm sorry. I'll do that in a second.
It's all right. We can hear you.
Good. All right. Yeah. So it was mostly the former, and I think for several reasons. One is this is a mix of this falls under a set of methodologies called Policy Studio. So it's a mix of policy analysis and the architectural studio idea. And so it's more that than, say, a media, film, culture. So it was much more of the descriptions, and then, diagrammatics. I think also, though, the world building very much has this notion that the context is supposed to come before the story, meaning that, and even when the descriptions or the concept behind the films that use world building, like Minority Report, is that you work hard to describe this world before you put the narrative story in it, because you really want the context to drive it and not the story. And when you're telling a story, or when you're doing a good job telling a story, most of the details that you report, even ones that may seem extraneous at the start, come together in the story. There's not a lot of baggage around it. And I think the idea of the world building is independent of, the narrative storyline. You really want to follow the logic of this world that you're creating. And then you can put the stories in it. But,
Justin,
go ahead. Yeah. I'm going to put my camera here.
Yeah, you can ask your question, Justin, while you.
Yeah. I had two quick questions. One was on methodology. It's been a few years since you did this study. I'm wondering if if you were to do it now and had more resources, how you might expand on what you did. And then second, I'm wondering if you have thoughts about how to aggregate worlds in a way to, one thing I'm interested in is how might we find policies that are robust to a wide set of worlds.
Mm-hmm.
And just wondering if you have any thoughts about how to do that.
Yeah, the main direction we wanted to go after this, and it's taken a while, but I think we're finally going to do it this summer, is to connect the world building to a backcasting. And we've done this a fair bit in the climate space, in doing things like you have one or several worlds, and on the robustness part, you have several future climate worlds. So for instance, different technology configurations for what a decarbonized US would look like, say, mid-century. And then you backcast each one of them individually, and then you try to tie them together and see, are there paths that, keep options open for different technology futures? So I think it would be really interesting to do that for this sort of, AI world building, particularly, push hard on the domains having to do with governance, society, and sort of the other sort of technology systems ideas. What was the other part of your question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, just how you might tie, how you think about finding strategies for good governance, like across different types of worlds was.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Basically doing that where you give people multiple worlds, you backcast and individually, and then you ask, and what we did in this other workshop, which I think actually worked pretty well, we then gave people pairs of scenarios. We had 4 scenarios. So we did an experimental design. One group got AB, one group got AC, another group got BD, and asked them to come up with a path that kept options open as long as they could for each pair of scenarios. And then we took that and worked it all together to come up with what looked like robust strategies. And for that one, I mean, it was basically, except for the heavy nuclear future, where you can have a lot of stranded assets if you head towards that one and then have to go to another one. Pretty much in all the others, you build transmission renewables, CCS on existing gas plants as fast as possible. And that, you can do that for 10 years and cut off many options.
Thank you. Yeah.
Aaron.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, very related to the conversation we just had. I was wondering in your assessment on to what degree world building helps with forecasting. Because I guess with backcasting, or like the immediate problem I see is I might pick a desirable future and then justify it in a way or find a path to it. But I wonder if there's a downside. But yeah, I'll let you go.
Or what do you mean by forecasting?
Let's put it like that. With backcasting, I feel like I can pick a very unlikely scenario. And with forecasting, I at least want to get a bit more clear, right? I might say, yeah, we're like heading in those 3 directions and this world is 1 in 3 out of whatever. And with backcasting, I feel like I'm the 1 in 1,000 category.
Yeah, backcasting is very much designed to think about ways to get to the desirable futures or to avoid undesirable futures. And at least the way, I think about these things in this decision-making under deep uncertainty style, you want to understand the policy choices before you then interrogate them with probabilities to see, what bets you want to take, essentially. But the way that I think this world building idea can contribute to a forecasting activity where you're looking to place probabilities on different outcomes, say by doing some sort of, super forecasting or, elicitation process from multiple forecasters, is that it might do a better job of defining the state space, the state potential future states of the world over which you're eliciting probability judgments. Because to get a good probability density function of future states, you need to enumerate the states before you go into the elicitation process. And, there's often, a challenge in doing that is that your state space is too constrained or, too ambiguous in the way you're phrasing your elicitation questions. Because, you were thinking of one future, but some of the others, people may think of another future. Having laid out these world building futures in some detail might allow you to do a better job of articulating the state space that you then do your elicitation on. I'm not sure that I've seen any examples of that. But anyways, that's a thought.
Okay, so we have 1 minute left, and that's a very long question, Kevin, but maybe you could ask it briefly.
Yeah,
do you want to
briefly, for summarizing my question, how would you just characterize a successful world building project? And I listened like some ideas that I thought of in my comment, but you don't have to address those.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, that is a great question. How do you evaluate these things? And so super quick, there are process measures and outcome measures. Process measures have to do with, do the people who participated in it, did they find it useful? Did it expand their thinking, et cetera? And we did a little bit of that in the back of the report. Then the outcome measures are harder, in part because you may need to, wait to see how you did. But it, ultimately, the way I think about it is you're trying to get to better decisions. So did the world building, contribute to a process where people had a wide enough view of the future to do things that turned out to be reasonable? So you don't, the world that you get doesn't need to look like the world that you imagined, but if imagining the world enabled you to do things that made you more robust, resilient, adaptive in the near term, that, helped you better prepare and better steer towards the world you got, turns out to be desirable, then the world building is useful. So process and then outcome measures.
Thank you so much, Robert. That's perfect. You're free to go now, but thank you so much for coming. And really
Good to join you, and thanks for all the great questions.